The cameras were already rolling when Kellyanne Conway's voice cut through the studio like a siren. She wasn't just raising her voice, she was screaming, leaning forward as if sheer volume could turn her spin into fact. Under the glare of the lights, every flicker of rage played across her face. The audience didn't breathe. For years they had seen Conway spar deflect, twist, but never had she unleashed like this, her words spilling in an avalanche of accusation and contempt. The host tried to interject, but Conway barreled on her. Voice sharp, jagged, relentless. Every syllable felt less like debate and more like an attack. And across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, silent, unmoved, hands folded, the picture of composure in the middle of a storm. The contrast was cinematic. One woman unraveling in fury, the other sitting calm as stone, every second of restraint raising the tension higher. The audience could feel it. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was something primal. Chaos against calm. Rage against reason. The very fabric of American discourse laid bare in two faces. Two voices, one frenzied, one poised, and as Conway's tirade reached its peak, she pointed across the table, her voice cracking with the force of her scream. People like you are the reason this country is falling apart. The words hung heavy in the studio, echoing with venom. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush to answer. She let the silence do its work, let the weight of Conway's outburst collapse under its own noise. The audience leaned in, breath caught, waiting for the inevitable clash. Because everyone knew what usually happened in these moments. Conway talked over, pushed through, claimed victory by sheer force. But tonight felt different. Something in Crockett's stillness carried power. It wasn't weakness, it wasn't hesitation, it was preparation. She was letting Conway burn herself out, letting the storm roar before dropping the strike of lightning that no one saw coming. And then came the pause, the longest pause of the night. Conway's voice faltered, just for a second, searching for her next line. That's when every eye shifted back to Jasmine, because America knew. This was the moment she would finally speak. This wasn't just another shouting match on cable television. It was unfolding in an America where every debate felt like a battlefield, where words were weapons, and polarization wasn't the backdrop, it was the air people breathed. The stakes were clear. Truth itself often seemed to be on trial. And no one embodied that struggle more than Kellyanne Conway, the seasoned political warrior whose reputation had been built on bending narratives. Until reality itself looked distorted. She wasn't just a guest on the show. She was a symbol of the old guard, sharp, theatrical, unapologetically manipulative. Against her sat Jasmine Crockett, a rising figure whose voice was only beginning to echo on the national stage. To some, she was still an unknown. To others, she was already the future, fearless, articulate, unwilling to play by the same tired rules. Tonight, her presence across from Conway wasn't chance. It was confrontation by design, the veteran of spin versus the newcomer armed with something far rare, unshakable composure and a commitment to truth. The tension wasn't just between two women. It was between two Americas. Conway's performance spoke to a politics addicted to spectacle, loud, unyielding, driven by theater more than facts. Crockett, on the other hand, represented a hunger for clarity, for dignity in discourse, for leaders who didn't see yelling as proof of strength. The contrast was electric. Every glare, every pause, every rising pitch of Conway's voice only magnified Crockett's refusal to be dragged into the circus. The audience, and across millions of screens at home, could feel the weight of it. This wasn't simply about who scored points in a debate. It was about what kind of leadership America still wanted to believe in. Would it be the chaos of spin and spectacle, or the calm persistence of truth-telling? And as Conway's tirade thundered on, Crockett's silence became louder than any rebuttal. It was a gamble, allowing the theatrics to stretch, allowing the outrage to crest, because Crockett knew that the country was watching not just what was said, but how it was said. The producers may have thought they were staging a segment. When the cameras rolled, what unfolded was far bigger than a political argument. It was a mirror held up to the nation's divide, A question pressed into the living rooms of millions. Which voice do we trust? The one that screams or the one that steadies? To understand the fury that erupted in that studio, you have to understand Kellyanne Conway. For years, she wasn't just a political advisor, she was a spectacle in her own right, a figure who seemed to thrive in the chaos she helped create. As counselor to the president, she rose to infamy not by smoothing tensions, but by sharpening them, by spinning narratives until truth itself felt negotiable. And in one infamous moment, she cemented her brand forever with two words that would follow her for the rest of her career: alternative facts. Those words weren't a slip of the tongues, they were a window into her worldview. To Conway, reality wasn't fixed. It was malleable, a script to be rewritten, depending on the needs of power. Where others saw facts as anchors, she saw them as obstacles to be maneuvered around. With a smile that could disarm and a cadence sharp enough to slice through interviews, she made deception look almost elegant. And for a while, it worked. The louder the outrage grew, the more her name trended. The more critics called her dishonest, the more she leaned into the role of master manipulator, basking in the attention it brought, but beneath the polished exterior lay a pattern of arrogance. Conway's trademark wasn't simply defending her side, it was dismissing her opponents as if they weren't even worth acknowledgement. She cut people off mid-sentence, spoke over them, and brushed aside evidence. With the wave of a hand, in televised debates, she thrived on chaos because chaos was her comfort zone. The louder the storm, the easier it was to obscure the truth. Her contradictions, however, began to pile up. One day, she would claim moral high ground. The next, she'd shrug off blatant inconsistencies. She styled herself as a truth-teller to the people, but her career was littered with evasions and deflections. Audiences started to notice. The charm that once dazzled began to look like performance. The confidence that once inspired awe started to resemble condescension, and the spin that once made her seem untouchable. It was slowly transforming into the very thing that exposed her. Still, Conway remained relentless. She went toe-to-toe with journalists, sparring not to enlighten, but to exhaust. She relied on repetition, on spectacle, on sheer force of will. In her world, the louder she spoke, the more convincing she believed she sounded. It was a strategy that had carried her through countless interviews, sparring matches, and political battles. To her supporters, she was fearless. To her critics, she was shameless. But either way, she was undeniably effective until she wasn't, because the same tactics that elevated Conway were beginning to betray her. In a political climate hungry for authenticity, her constant theatrics felt increasingly hollow. Smirks looked less like confidence and more like dismissal. Her quick comebacks, once sharp, now felt rehearsed, like lines from a play everyone had already seen too many times. And then came Jasmine Crockett. Unlike the journalists Conway had bulldozed, Crockett wasn't there to play her game. Wasn't trying to outshout, outspin, or outperform. Crockett's very presence was an indictment of Conway's approach. Where Conway embodied noise, Crockett radiated clarity. Where Conway used spectacle as a shield, Crockett used silence. As a weapon, it was a new kind of opponent for Conway, and one she wasn't ready for. Because what happens when the tactics that once made you famous suddenly fall flat? What happens when the smirk that used to silence a room only makes your opponent look stronger? For Conway, it meant the foundations of her persona were cracking. In real time, her downfall wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic collapse in one singular moment. It was something subtler, more humiliating. The slow realization that the power she once wielded no longer landed the same way. That her voice, raised to a scream, didn't silence but spotlighted her desperation. That her performance wasn't dominating the stage, it was unraveling before a live audience. Kellyanne Conway had built a career on controlling the narrative. But that night, in that studio, the narrative slipped from her hands. And as the cameras rolled, her old tricks began to look less like brilliance and more like the relics of a fading era. Because the truth was this: the very chaos that once made her untouchable was now the stage for her undoing. And for the first time in years. Kellyanne Conway was about to face an opponent who didn't just survive the storm, she thrived in the calm after it. Jasmine Crockett didn't stumble into the spotlight. She fought her way there, long before she was trending across social media feeds, before she sat under the bright, unforgiving lights of a national debate stage. She was a young woman in Texas, learning the language of struggle the hard way. Unlike Kellyanne Conway, whose rise was cushioned by privileged connections and carefully constructed image-making, Crockett's journey was shaped by grit. Every step forward was earned, not handed. Growing up in Dallas, she saw firsthand how communities could be silenced and ignored. Schools were underfunded, neighborhoods overlooked, voices dismissed. It wasn't theory to hurt, was lived reality. That planted something deep inside her, a conviction that justice wasn't some lofty word politicians tossed around. It was survival, dignity, an opportunity for people who rarely got a fair shot. When she decided to study law, it wasn't because it was glamorous. It was because she knew the courtroom was one of the few arenas where the powerless could still fight back. But even in law school, Crockett wasn't treated as the golden prodigy. She was underestimated, often the only black woman in a room, and constantly questioned about whether she belonged. Professors doubted her, peers dismissed her. She remembers late nights when she'd stay in the library long after others had gone home, not just to pass her courses, but to prove to them and to herself that she could master the very system that wasn't built for her. And when she graduated, Crockett didn't chase the big paychecks of corporate law firms. She chose the harder path: civil rights, public defense, representing the people most lawyers ignored. It meant long hours, emotional tolls, and very little financial reward. She represented clients who couldn't pay, families who were hanging by a thread, communities that felt invisible. Many of those cases didn't make headlines, but each one mattered. Each one added to her resolve. There were sacrifices along the way. Nights without sleep, weeks without a real day off, friendships strained because her work always came first. She often walked into courtrooms knowing the odds were stacked, that the system was tilted, that victory wasn't guaranteed. She fought anyway. And when she lost, she didn't crumble. She came back sharper, tougher, more relentless. One story in particular captures her spirit. Early in her career, she represented a young man accused of a crime he didn't commit. The evidence against him was flimsy, but the prosecution pressed hard. Banking on the fact that he couldn't afford a high-powered attorney, Crockett poured everything into the case, digging through records, interviewing witnesses, challenging every weak point. She worked through nights, fueled by coffee and determination, knowing that if she didn't give her all, this man's life could be destroyed. When the jury finally delivered a not guilty verdict, she didn't just save her client, to herself and to everyone watching, that the fight for justice was worth every ounce of sacrifice, that discipline carried her from the courtroom into politics. She saw that laws themselves, those written in distant chambers by people insulated from real struggle, were the root of so many battles she faced as an attorney. If she wanted to change the system, she couldn't just fight case by case. She had to step into the arena where those laws were made. But stepping into politics meant stepping into fire. As a young black woman, she was underestimated at every turn. Opponents called her inexperienced. Critics tried to reduce her to a caricature. Attack ads painted her as radical. Pundits dismissed her as too emotional. She endured insults about her voice, her appearance, even her intelligence. And yet every attempt to tear her down only made her stronger. Where others saw vulnerability, she found fuel. What separated Crockett from someone like Conway wasn't just ideology, it was authenticity. Conway learned to manipulate narratives in TV studios. Crockett forged hers in courtrooms, community meetings, and on the ground with people whose lives were at stake. Conway's armor was privilege. Crockett's was integrity. That integrity was forged through failure and persistence. When bills she supported stalled in committee, she didn't retreat, she rallied harder. When protesters were dismissed by lawmakers, she stood with them. When journalists questioned whether she could withstand the cruelty of national politics, she didn't flinch. She had already survived worse. She had already stared down a system designed to break her. Behind her sharp arguments and fiery presence was discipline most people never saw. She woke before dawn to read case files or policy papers, sometimes skipping meals to prepare for hearings. She trained her mind the way athletes train their bodies: repetition, endurance, resilience. And every setback taught her a lesson she carried forward. That's what made her dangerous to someone like Conway. Conway thrived on spectacle, but Crockett thrived on substance. Conway spun words into fog, but Crockett cut through with clarity. Conway dismissed opponents with arrogance. Crockett dismantled them with facts grounded in lived experience. It was never about theatrics for Crockett. It was about truth, and that truth came with scars. It came from a lifetime of being underestimated, from battles fought in courtrooms where the stakes were freedom itself. From years of proving wrong the people who said she didn't belong, all of that the late nights. The sacrifice, the grit wasn't just background noise. It was preparation. Because one day she would find herself sitting across from someone who embodied everything she had fought against: privilege without accountability, spin without substance, arrogance without empathy. That day had come. The cameras were rolling. The nation was watching. And Jasmine Crockett knew one thing with absolute certainty. All of it had prepared her for this very moment on live TV. The cameras were rolling, stage perfectly lit, and the nation was tuned in. What began as a panel discussion quickly mutated into a storm of interruptions and accusations. Kellyanne Conway leaned forward in her chair, her voice rising above everyone else's. She jabbed her finger toward Jasmine Crockett, accusing her of hypocrisy, incompetence, and whatever else she could conjure in the moment. It was the kind of verbal blitz Conway had perfected: overwhelm, distract, dominate through sheer force of noise. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't even shift in her seat. She listened. Her stillness became its own form of power. While Conway's voice climbed into a shout, Crockett's silence drew the audience's eyes to her, as if they were waiting for her response. Conway, sensing she wasn't getting the usual pushback, grew more frantic. She accused Crockett of being just another radical voice who was out of her depth. She tried to talk over the host, talk over the other panelists, even talk over herself, stacking words on words until they collapsed into noise. Each new interruption was a performance. A reminder of the old playbook Conway had used on cable news for years: never concede, never pause. Never let the other side breathe, and yet Crockett breathed. Her posture was steady, shoulders relaxed, eyes fixed not on Conway's fury, but on the truth of the moment. Every time Conway smirked or tossed out a sarcastic jab, Crockett's calm became sharper. It was as if Conway's rising volume only carved out more space for Crockett's eventual reply. The audience in the studio leaned forward. The contrast was striking. Conway's face grew flushed under the studio lights, her words tumbling over one another, while Crockett looked as though she could be sitting at home, sipping tea, waiting for the storm to pass. This wasn't passivity, it was strategy. Every interruption was ammunition she stored quietly, carefully. And the longer Crockett held her ground, the clearer the power shift became. Viewers at home could feel it. Social media clips were already being typed out in real time. Watch Crockett keep her cool while Conway unravels. Conway thought she was winning the moment with volume, but the silence spoke louder. The moderator tried to rein Conway in, but she bulldozed through, raising her voice again and again, thinking that if she could dominate the air, she could dominate the truth. Instead, the opposite happened. With every scream, with every insult, Conway revealed more about her desperation than her conviction. Crockett finally leaned forward, the faintest hint of a smile playing at her lips. The tension was unbearable now, stretched tight across the room. The louder Conway screamed, the more powerful Crockett's calm became, for what felt like an eternity. Jasmine Crockett had let Conway rage unchecked. She had listened to the finger-pointing, the shouting, the endless interruptions. The studio was heavy with tension. The moderator looked ready to intervene, the audience unsure how much longer the spectacle could last. And then finally Crockett leaned forward, exhaled, and spoke. Her voice was steady, not loud, not theatrical, just sharp enough to cut through the chaos like a scalpel. "Kellyanne," she began, pausing deliberately, "you've made a career out of twisting words. But tonight, your own words have twisted you." The silence that followed was electric. Conway froze for a fraction of a second, her mouth half open, as if preparing another outburst. But the rhythm had shifted. Crockett controlled the floor. She had taken Conway's chaos and distilled it into a single, undeniable truth. Crockett's delivery was masterful, calm, surgical, perfectly timed. She didn't rush. Each sentence landed with precision. She reminded Conway of her infamous alternative facts line, not with anger, but with quiet authority. "You once told America that truth was optional, that we could live in a world of alternative facts. And maybe you got away with that in the White House briefing room. But here tonight so you don't get to hide behind spin." The audience erupted with applause. Conway's eyes darted around, her practiced smile faltering. She tried to interject, but Crockett's rhythm was unstoppable. She didn't raise her voice. She lowered it, forcing everyone to lean in and listen. "You accuse me of being unqualified?" Crockett continued. "Let's talk qualifications. I've spent years in courtrooms, fighting for people who didn't have power, who didn't have a voice. I've had to prove myself with evidence, with facts, with integrity. Meanwhile, she paused here, the silence stretching just long enough to make the point sting. You built your reputation by selling the American people a lie." Conway shifted in her seat, visibly rattled. Her usual strategy, dominate through volume, was failing. She raised her voice again, tried to talk over Crockett, but now the audience had turned. The crowd groaned at Conway's interruptions, while they leaned into Crockett's words, and Crockett, unfazed, pressed forward. "You talk about chaos. You created chaos. You defended it. You normalized it. And the difference between us, Kellyanne, is that I didn't come into politics to be famous. I came here because I know what happens when people like you play games with the truth. Real families suffer. Real people get hurt." The audience was on its feet now, clapping, cheering, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the contrast. Unfolding before them, Conway's trademark smirk was gone. She fumbled, stammered, her voice cracking as she tried to shout over the applause. That's not true." But Crockett only grew calmer. Each pause, each measured word amplified the moment. She wasn't just answering Conway, she was dismantling her, and then came the line. The sentence that would ricochet across social media within minutes. The phrase that every headline would lift the next morning. Crockett leaned back slightly, looked Conway directly in the eye, and said, "You don't shout the truth into existence. You shout because you've already lost it." The studio went silent. Dead silent. For a heartbeat, it felt as if time had stopped. And then the eruption came: cheers, applause, gasps, even laughter. The clip was destined to go viral before the show even ended. Conway, for the first time in memory, looked small. Not because a volume she was still trying to speak, still trying to force words into the air, but because the audience no longer believed her. The louder she got, the weaker she appeared. The moderator, sensing the shift, turned to Conway with a question. But she fumbled, her answers tangled, her voice cracking under the weight of her unraveling performance. Crockett, meanwhile, sat composed, hands folded, a faint smile on her face. She didn't need to add another word. She had already won. On Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, the clip exploded in real time. Hashtag Crockett.com and hashtag TruthOverNoise began trending. One user posted, "This is how you handle chaos with facts, not fury." Another wrote, "Kellyanne brought the volume, Crockett brought the mic drop." Even journalists, hardened to political theater, couldn't ignore the spectacle. Headlines began drafting themselves. Jasmine Crockett turns Conway's scream into silence. Calm versus chaos. The night Conway finally met her match. One sentence silenced the storm. The commentary was unanimous. Crockett had flipped the script. She hadn't just won a debate. She had exposed the weakness of Conway's entire persona. For years, Conway thrived on shouting down her opponents, on creating confusion and noise, until truth itself felt negotiable. But against Crockett's calm, the noise collapsed. It was more than a debate moment. It was symbolic. Too many watching. It felt like a generational handoff. The theatrics of the old guard, giving way to the composure and fact-driven clarity of a new political voice. As the cameras pulled back, the image was unmistakable. Conway still fuming, still trying to talk over applause, and Crockett quiet, steady, victorious. Contrast said more than any poll or pundit could, and as the credits rolled, one phrase lingered in the minds of millions. You don't shout the truth into existence. You shout because you've already lost it. The studio lights had barely dimmed when the first clips hit the internet. Someone in the control room had leaked the exchange within minutes, and by the time the East Coast settled into late night, scrolling TikTok was ablaze. 10-second sound bites of Conway shrieking, juxtaposed with Crockett's poised silence, looped endlessly, set to dramatic music, captions screaming, "This is how you shut down arrogance." On Twitter, the hashtags ignited like wildfire. Hashtag Crockett.com / hashtag Conway MELTDOWN, hashtag truth over noise. One clip alone racked up 1 million views before sunrise. Users stitched the moment into their own commentary, young activists praising the Congresswoman for embodying strength, immigrant families reposting with notes about dignity. Even comedians remixing Conway's voice into parodies that made her tirade sound like a tantrum from a reality show by morning. A side-by-side photo spread across feeds, Conway mid-scream, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched, and beside her, Crockett still, serene, gaze unbroken. The caption read simply, "Volume does not equal power." Another meme showed a roaring lion silenced by a quiet lamb, except the lamb's face had been replaced with Crockett's. People weren't just laughing. They were celebrating. Celebrities began chiming in. A-list actors and pop stars retweeted the clip with fire emojis and applause. One musician wrote, "This is the kind of energy we need in America right now. Calm truth shutting down chaos." Civil rights leaders called it a master in composure. Even late-night hosts picked it up, replaying the exchange with biting commentary. Their audiences roaring with laughter at Conway's unraveling. Politicians couldn't ignore it. Progressive leaders hailed Crockett as a rising star, proof that a new generation of leadership was ready to meet the chaos of politics with dignity. Some conservatives, scrambling to defend Conway, called the viral wave overblown theatrics. But even they couldn't deny what the footage revealed. A battle of character, Conway had lost control. Commentators across the spectrum declared it a defining moment. One columnist wrote, "Every so often, politics gives us an image that sticks in the national memory. Nixon sweating under the lights, Obama singing Amazing Grace, and now, Jasmine Crockett's silence, outlasting Kellyanne Conway's." Scream cable networks replayed the clip in endless cycles. Panels debated what it meant. Was it just a viral sensation, or was it something deeper? Some argued it was proof that Americans were tired of volume and spin. Others saw it as a generational torch passing, one era of political combat giving way to another. Through it all, Crockett herself remained measured. Reporters swarmed her office, begging for interviews, but she refused to gloat. When finally pressed for comment, she said softly, "It wasn't about me. It was about showing that truth doesn't need to shout." So that single line added fuel to the fire. Screenshots of her quotes spread as fast as the memes, cementing her as not just a politician, but a symbol. And that was the shift. Crockett, once known mostly to her district in Texas, suddenly became a national name. News outlets labeled her the calm that conquered. Magazine covers featured her with bold headlines, "The Future of Political Courage." For young activists and voters seeking a model of integrity, she became a beacon overnight. Meanwhile, Conway's legacy took another hit. Clips of her famous alternative facts moment resurfaced, now recontextualized as part of a long pattern. Commentators asked aloud, had the very tactics that built her career finally collapsed under their own weight? As one viral tweet put it, "She spun lies for years. But lies can't outshout the truth forever." The debate no longer belonged to that single night in the studio. It became a cultural moment, etched into America's collective consciousness. In classrooms, media literacy professors played the clip to discuss composure versus spectacle. Churches and community halls, It was cited as an example of dignity in conflict. For immigrant families, it resonated as a reminder that you don't need to scream to be heard, you just need to stand firm. The ripple effects kept spreading. Grassroots groups began sharing Crockett's words in campaign emails. Donors from outside Texas reached out, eager to support her. She was invited onto national platforms not to rehash the clash, but to talk about her vision for justice and truth in politics. What began as a viral moment was quickly transforming into something larger, a shift in how people imagined leadership. And yet, in the middle of this firestorm, Crockett herself kept her focus. To her, it wasn't about a meme, a hashtag, or even the sudden surge of fame. It was about proving a point she had carried all her life, that dignity is stronger than arrogance. And truth has its own gravity. The internet might have crowned her the victor. Pundits might have declared it a turning point in Conway's career. But for Crockett, the meaning was deeper, quieter, more enduring, because in her mind, this moment wasn't hers to claim. It belonged to something greater. When the storm of memes, hashtags, and headlines finally began to settle, Jasmine Crockett did something that revealed the core of her character. While others framed the viral clash as a knockout blow or a career-defining humiliation, for Kellyanne Conway, Crockett refused to let the moment be reduced to spectacle. She wasn't interested in winning a shouting match or basking in digital applause. For her, it was never about humiliating an opponent. It was about standing firm in truth. Even when chaos tried to drown it out, Crockett understood something vital. In a nation addicted to outrage, it is easy to confuse volume with strength. But in that studio, she proved that real strength comes from composure. Where Conway had tried to weaponize theatrics interruptions, accusations, Decibel's Crockett responded with patience, clarity, and precision. And that choice carried a universal lesson, because the truth is bigger than politics. It lives in the quiet courage of a leader who doesn't match insult with insult, but instead elevates the conversation. Crockett reframed the debate not as a contest of egos, but as a test of integrity. She embodied the principle that dignity doesn't need to shout, it simply stands its ground, speaks with conviction. The deeper message resonated far beyond the walls of that studio. Viewers from immigrant households, young activists, and ordinary families across the country felt something stir inside them. They saw proof that arrogance doesn't have to win, that the calm persistence of truth can still silence even the loudest theatrics. Crockett's composure reminded them of leaders from history, those who had faced jeers, insults, and attacks, yet chose principle over performance. And in that realization lay the emotional crescendo. This wasn't just a clapback, it was proof that in an age where truth often feels fragile, it can still stand tall and unshaken. Crockett's reply became more than a viral moment. It became a symbol of what politics could look like if guided by courage instead of chaos. The lesson was as much about America as it was about Crockett and Conway. A divided nation had been shown a glimpse of another way forward, not one paved by mockery or volume, but by the steady light of integrity. Crockett's silence before she spoke, her calm as she delivered each word, and her refusal to descend into pettiness offered a template for how discourse could be restored. She had reminded the country of something it desperately needed to hear: truth doesn't need theatrics. Integrity will always outlast arrogance. And in the end, the most powerful voice in the room is not the one that screams, but the one that speaks with dignity. For Crockett, that night was never about personal victory. It was about proving that courage rooted in principle can rise above the noise. And for those watching, it became a call to demand more from their leaders. To believe in the possibility of politics that inspire rather than divide, and to remember that even in a culture of chaos, truth still carries weight. Because what America saw was not just a clash on live TV. It was a reminder, sharp and undeniable, dignity can still win. And the question hung in the air, waiting to be answered: what if more leaders chose to fight? Like Crockett, with courage, with courage, with truth. And so, we returned to where it all began, a live TV clash where Kellyanne Conway tried to dominate with rage, only to be undone by JasmineCrockett.com. Unshakable Truth. The title of this story was no exaggeration, Conway screamed, but it was Crockett's poise that shut her down. Not with insults, not with theatrics, but with facts delivered in a voice steady enough to silence the storm. That is the moral clarity we so often crave in our leaders. In an era where shouting matches are mistaken for debates and performance, often overshadows principle, Crockett reminded us of a timeless truth. Real leadership isn't about who can yell the loudest. It's about who can stand firm, even in the face of chaos, and still speak with dignity. America needs more of this. Not more arrogance, not more noise, but more leaders who understand that integrity outshines spectacle. Crockett didn't just respond to Conway. She modeled a way forward for all of us. She showed that calm courage can turn the tide, that composure can win battles that volume never could. And now the moment is bigger than the debate itself. It's about us. About whether we're ready to demand more from those who claim to represent us, whether we're willing to lift up voices of truth over voices of arrogance, whether we will choose dignity over division. If you believe in standing up to arrogance with dignity, if you believe that calm truth still has the power to silence even the loudest noise, then don't let this moment fade. Subscribe, share. This story is to add your voice to the movement for leaders who rise above the noise, because change doesn't start with a scream, it starts with a choice.